On the other hand, we should consider that zoological studies in Sanskrit included a number of texts on the elephant, such as the text by Palakapia. And so we can say, as I will try to show in this paper, that the Indo-Persian text on the elephant appeared when different layers of Muslim societies interact with this animal and needed to appropriate knowledge on it from the Hindu environment. So, in South Asia, writing in Persian on the elephant emerges as a multidisciplinary discourse. We find monographic works on the elephant, as the one that I will show you today, and also chapter and description in other kind of text, like historical and encyclopedic work, such as the Ain Akbari, which has quite an interesting chapter on the elephant, where, for example, he discusses the psychology of the elephant in relation to the three guna of the Hindu philosophy, and also the Nujum al-Ulum. I was not able to see this chapter, and I rely on the description that is given by M. Flat in his study of the Nujum al-Ulum. And then the Muslim rulers, and they wrote in their memoir about the elephant, such as, for example, the Babur Nama, which include quite an interesting description of this animal. And we have the Safar Nama of Muslim voyagers, such as the one by Abdul Latif Khan Shustari, who visited Bengal and Burma. We have to remember that the eastern regions of South Asia were the main, still nowadays, the main natural habitat for elephants in South Asia. And also about the other memoirs, we have to remember those of Jahangir, who asked to recalculate the period of pregnancy of the elephant, compared to the period that was indicated in the Ain Akbari, which is quite interesting to see all this kind of empirical experimentation on this animal was taking place at the Muslim court. So for what is concerned the Indo-Persian treatise on the elephant, again, we find different kind of text. We have translation of Sanskrit sources, such as this Filname, which is written by Sad Akbar ibn Awliya ibn Hasan Hakim, which was chiefly based on the translation of two Sanskrit texts on the elephant, the work by Brahaspati, and Asti Ayurveda by Palakapia. And then we have apocryphal works such as the Kursinamaya Mahavadgiri, which I'm talking today, and the Gajaraj Nama, which is attributed to a certain Ibrahim Qutb Shah. Of this text, I only found one manuscript until now, and it seems another apocryphal writing. And also we find some Masnavi poems on elephant hunting. I have to say that I've not been able until now to see these poems. I found them mentioned in the catalogs of manuscript and bibliographical surveys of manuscripts, such Marshall, for example, but I haven't seen any of this. There are at least a few of them. So I'm not sure, for example, if they are referring to the fact of hunting with the elephant or hunting the elephant, for example. So if anybody has more information about this treatise, it would be interesting to share. And we can see here the first page of this Nama by Sad Akbar ibn Awliya, which is this composite translation of the Brahaspati Mat and Asti Ayurveda. I give a description of this treatise in chapter of my last book on Persian culture and Ayurvedic medicine, published by Brill, which has been mentioned earlier. And so I will try to go faster. And so we know the Muslim kings certainly were among the Muslim groups the most interacted with elephants, but we know also that certain Muslim physicians were known for the skills in elephant treatment. For example, Sheikh Bina and Hassan Mukarrab Khan. The first was a physician at court of Akbar, and Mukarrab Khan was the governor of several Mughal provinces. So it is quite possible that he himself possessed a specimen of this animal. And the importance acquired by the Muslim as a filban or mahavat, and to say elephant keeper, is especially clear by this description that is given by James Skinner in the Tashrikul Aqwam, where in the chapter on the filban, at the end of the chapter, he writes that in the Muslim age, many filban abandoned the Hindu religion and converted to Islam. In some places, such as Deccan and Jaipur, there are still Hindu filban, while in the other regions, they're all Muslims. So it is quite indicative now of the very important role acquired by the mid-19th century of Muslims. This, for example, it is an illustration from the Tashrikul Aswam, where we can see now the filban is clearly Muslim. And so the Kursinameh Mahavatgiri, it is a short treatise of a known period that, in my opinion, was probably associated with the guilds of elephant keepers, as I will try to show later. So manuscript copies of these texts that I've seen until now, I think they were all produced during the 18th and the 19th century, as far as I can say. But there are several copies which I have not seen until now. Actually, most of the copies are dispersed between many libraries, different libraries. So until now, I didn't have access to several copies. And the codex, the manuscript of the Kursinameh, also include often two other texts. Most of the manuscript, I think only one doesn't include these other two texts. The first is another anonymous text on the elephant and its treatment that circulated at least in one occasion.
हाँ, वो Fabrizio का start हो गया है program.
Also circulated as an independent.
अच्छा, आप हैं इसके अंदर? अच्छा. Okay.
Please mute yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you. And also as an independent work. And also we find very often a glossary of Arabic, Persian, and Indic terms that also include the names of remedies. We can see here the opening page of the glossary with in one of the copy in which there is also the Kursinameh Mahavatgiri. So in my opinion, most of the copies I have seen show that these three texts circulated together. And so at the beginning of the text, the Kursinameh Mahavatgiri is attributed to a certain Sayyid Ahmad Kabir, but in reality it's a fictive name, because then we understand that it's also one of the legendary men to which the origin of the profession it is associated with in the Kursinameh, the genealogy that is given at the end of the text. So the text is structured in a dialogic, so al-Jawab style, and it discusses the origin of the mahout and the elephant and a few other topics, including several Islamic invocations to be recited by the elephant keepers, such as the Kursinameh, the genealogy of the mahout, and also the Khutbeh Filan, which is another invocation given there, and also a number of other invocations are given there. For example, the invocation to say when you have to ride the elephant in a certain way, when you have to turn left, when you have to turn right, the invocation before doing the ghusl to the elephant, etc. So, I mean, and some of them, for example, include also the names of Allah. So the first two questions deal with the origin of the Mahavat profession. The first answer explains that the first mahout lived during the time of Noah, and before that the elephant was dim. The second explained that the first three elephant keepers were Ahmad Kabir, Khwaja Sultan Ahmad Kabir, and Khwaja Ahmad, who were also the son of Mahmud and the grandsons of Noah, because Mahmud was the son of Noah, the prophet of Noah, according to the genealogy presented at the end of the text, which goes back to the prophet Adam. So this narrative associates the profession origin with a well-known episode of the Islamic view of ancient history. That is to say, the story of Prophet Noah and the flood. This was well known in Muslim culture, especially through the Quran. There is the chapter of Noah, and which is, and also other parts of the Quran refer to the flood. And in this narrative, the elephant is among the animals rescued in the ark. And this is attested in the description of the ark, which is given, for example, in the popular genre of the Qisasul Anbiya, and as I say, the stories of the prophet. And the fact that this circulated also in the Muslim culture of South Asia is attested also by illustration of the ark, such as in the miniature of Noah, which is attributed to Miskin. You can see it here. There was one of the leading painter of the Mughal court during Akbar period. And you can see the elephant here. There are two specimens of elephant. And near these people, they're trying to rescue another people from the water. Now you can see these two specimens of the elephant. And so the Mahout, the Kursiname is presented in the last part of the text. And it is a list of names that begins with Noah grandson and goes back to Adam. So it is a pattern that really looks like that of the Sufi silsila, also the genealogy, that is to say the chain of the spiritual masters that goes back to Muhammad. And the learning of the Kursiname and the other invocation is presented as a duty for the Mahabbat. If the Mahout is not able to read, he must have these prayers written and keep them with him. In another passage, also the text say to the Mahout to bring every year the Kursiname to his spear, as to say, as you know, the Sufi master. So I show you this Kursiname from the copy which is in Hyderabad. As you can say, it's a list of names, very typical styles like the seals, you know, like an instant name one after the other, which end with the Prophet Adam here. No, you can say here, where is my mouse? And so similar forms of devotion, of Islamic devotion, developed also among Indian Muslim horse keepers. We've been talking about this text, the Tarjumeh Salotar by Allah ibn Safi, in an article which has been recently published on Perso Indica with Eva Orthmann. You can see here the reference. In which we find a kind of this kind of Islamic prayer to the prophets, which the horses are represented in miniatures included in the manuscript copies. And so you can find more about this in this article, which is available online. And so we have to remember that the recitation and also this kind of Islamic prayer that we find for the horse keeper resembles the pattern of the Sufi silsila. And so we have to remind that the recitation of the master silsila is a collective ritual practiced by many Sufi groups in South Asia, and it's possible the groups of Muslim elephant and horse keepers developed a kind of analogous practices.
So you have 5 minutes remaining.
Yeah, they will be sufficient. So you can see here one of the manuscript copy, the one in Montreal of the Tarjumeh Salotar, in which we see this list of names, which are a name of prophets and the name of their horses. Also, you see the beginning, Ilahi Bahurmat, etc., which is also very, very typical of the Sufi silsila. Now there are certain Sufi silsila, for example, those of the Naqshbandiya, which begins exactly with the same formula. And before being tamed by Noah grandson, therefore the elephant was a demon. And this issue is further discussed in the third, fourth, and fifth set of question and answer. So this explains that elephant used to be green, but it has turned black due to his sin. His sin is that he fornicated with a famine black demon named Barnanus, and a black elephant was born from this union. I have no idea if this is a narrative taken from Sanskrit text. I don't know if there is anything similar. I haven't found until now anything similar. If any of you have a suggestion about this Barna news, whichever also, yeah, okay. And so I will skip this issue. And the 8th question asks which part of the elephant are pure and abominable. And you see the forefront is pure, the teeth are impure, while the tail is abominable. In conclusion, the course in Amaya Mahavat Giri fabricates an Islamic myth about the Mahout as a profession practiced by the descendant of a prophet and connected with the Quranic narrative of the flood. Placing this narrative during no epoch after the flood allowed to accommodate the event in the Islamic view of ancient history. But in my view, the fabricated Islamized mythology can be understood as a reply to earlier Islamic negative views on the elephant. So the Islamic mythology allowed to rehabilitate the negative view about the Mahout, which came from the Quran, which I will come right away. And second, to reinterpret the demoniac feature associated with the elephant in Muslim culture. So the elephant as a kind of satanic symbol was particularly associated in the Muslim culture with the Quranic chapter of the elephant, where it is narrated the story of the Aksumite, a king who tried to attack Mecca with some elephant in the ear of the elephant, so-called ear of the elephant. It was the ear of Muhammad's birth and was defeated by a God miracle. And the surah of the elephant is particularly harsh with the master, the ashab of the elephant, who were very severely punished by God. And this has been studied especially in this article, which you find here by Ali Anushahr, published in 2018. And also we have to remember that according to the ulama, elephant is a food forbidden by Muslim, because the ulama is a predator, can kill other animals, although it doesn't eat the meat of other animals. And the course in Amay, therefore, was primarily destined to be recited and listened by the Mahout in the way in which it is described in the text. The Mahout is clearly say that it has to learn by heart this recitation and this kind of duty to enter the guild of the profession. And so, like the Sufi silsila, this type of genealogical documents served a main purpose, to legitimate the transmission of knowledge. So apocryphal authorship is part of the intentional strategy aiming to legitimate the practice from an Islamic viewpoint, which was certainly a very important need for the many Muslims who became involved in the field of elephant care. The creation of a written genealogical document of an Islamized ritual as a silsila act as a means to create a control authority both within professional groups and on their social environment. And in my view, it will not be surprising if the commissioners of this text were the same Goils of Mahout, some of which could have become rather influential due to their close association with the royal environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fabrizio. Thank you very much. We did enjoy your presentation, and it was very helpful. It was very informative. And I hope Professor Chandrasekhar, who has joined us while you were presenting the paper, will have something to say by the end of the session about your paper. And I was really, I enjoyed your paper. That is for me on a personal note. With that note, I would like to invite Professor Harbans Mukhia to present his paper. And presenting Professor Harbans Mukhia is something not of a routine thing. Basically, Professor Harbans Mukhia needs no introduction per se. He was a professor of medieval history and the rector of Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. and he has been widely published, and he has taught medieval Indian history at India, and he has written many books which have been published by various authors, various publishers, sorry, namely Oxford and various other publishers in Indian and European publishing houses. He has been given many fellowships, including the IIAS Shimla Fellowship, or he has been given the Homi Bhabha Fellow Award of the Fellowship, and many others. He has been the founder editor of the Medieval History Journal, which has been published by Sage Publishers, New Delhi. And in 2011, he was the grand witness at the Paris Museum, Musée de Kai Branly, for a 2-hour public interview about his life. So with that introduction, I would like to go to Professor Harbans Mukhia to present his paper, which is about aspects of medieval India's Persian language historiography. Professor Harbans Mukhia, sir.
Sir, please unmute your mic.
Well, thank you very much for this very generous introduction. Is Professor Chandrasekhar around? I don't see him here.
But yes, sir, he's
there. Yes, I see you. Thank you very much, Chandrasekhar, for remembering me this morning. It was a very casual kind of meeting, and thank you very much for remembering a very casual kind of meeting.
Mine pleasure, sir, mine pleasure.
Of course, we have all gathered to pay our homage to Professor Abidi. I started learning Persian from Professor Abidi, not as a formal student, but outside the class on the recommendation of my guru, Dr. K.M. Ashraf, in 1960, I think, or 61. And it's the Persian that I learned from him that enabled me to do my research on historiography, etc., and other. So it's my privilege to pay my homage to Professor Abidi. I'll be speaking to you on Persian language historiography of medieval India. It's a huge subject. It would take a huge amount of time, but since I have 20 minutes to go, I'll confine myself to 2 aspects of this theme. One is the aspect of its linkages to Islam, the linkages of medieval Indian historiography, Persian language historiography to Islam. And the second is the nature of historical explanation embedded in these Persian texts. Now, first of all, let's note that almost all, probably all the historians that we speak of were courtiers. Even when they're theologians like Mullah Abdul Qadir Badaini, they were courtiers. And the fact that they were courtiers had a to do with their view of history. But I'll come to that in a moment. Now, first, the linkage with Islam. Islam brings to the world not only a new religion, but also a concept of history that was unknown to the Arab world. The Arab world was not illiterate, certainly it was literate, but it had no concept of history until then. It's Islam which brings the concept of history. First, it brings this concept of history to beginning with the biographies of Muhammad and caliphs and so on and so forth, then in the Arab world. And then it begins to expand to the study of societies and civilizations and so on and so forth. So it's a great expansion from biographies to civilization, study of civilizations and societies and so on and so forth. And Tabari also brought in the concept of world history. Now, this is one form of expansion, one dimension of this expansion that is characteristic of the Arab world, the Arab Muslim world, where this expansion, this origin and expansion of history writing takes place in a very magnificent way, massive way. There is also another tradition, which is a Persia-Mongol tradition, which is also linked to Islam, of course, but it takes a different direction altogether. It's concentrated more on dynastic histories rather than histories of societies and civilizations and so on and so forth. These dynastic histories are again a very fascinating reduction of they are written in the context of world history, but there is a great reduction here. The reduction is from world history. They are studying really they are studying really the history of a region of the world. The perspective is world history, but the study is confined to a region of the world. And within that region, they are studying the history of ruling dynasties. And ruling dynasties history is not dynasties as such, but reigns of each ruler and down to the current ruler. So that it's a grand reduction, as I said, of the concept of world history to regional history and the concept of study of periods to the study of reigns. So it's a gradual reduction of the inheritance from the Arab tradition. It is it's a tradition which is compared to contemporary Europe, it was far more advanced in many ways. Europe, uh, European history writing at this time, it wasn't history writing per se. It was really accounts given to about events by what they call respectable people who can be trusted. So there is no there is no there is no awareness of checking the authenticity of events that are being described or narrated. There is no awareness of checking whether what is being described, what is being narrated has really been is really true to history, or it's merely because it's narrated to us by a trustworthy person, therefore you have to accept it. So the notion of checking the authenticity or investigating the authenticity of events being narrated, that wasn't present in Europe. But in the tradition that we are talking of, Arab tradition and later on Persia, Mongol tradition, and also Indian tradition, medieval Indian tradition, there is a sense uh, of the awareness of the checking of these, or the authenticating the events that are being narrated. How does that occur? It occurs primarily through the very great insistence on chronology, the chronological sequence of events. Uh, there is a very strict adherence to the the chronological sequencing of events that are being narrated, and that chronological and particularly the system of Abjad particularly reinforces this sequencing of chronological sequencing of events, and therefore that sequencing of events itself is a kind of authenticating the event that is being narrated. That's one part. The other part is which doesn't relate to history per se, but really theology, more theology than history. But the notion of isnad, which, as I said, pertains to theology more than history. Nonetheless, there is an awareness that what is being stated has to be its authenticity has to be established. So the notion of authenticity, or the notion or the awareness of the need for authenticity, authenticating, however however primitive, if you like, the awareness may be, but the awareness was there, which was completely absent in medieval, or what we call medieval European history writing. So it was a very advanced, relatively speaking, very advanced, both in terms of its scope and space of themes, as well as in terms of authenticating the events, or at least an attempt at authenticating the events that are being narrated. So it's a fairly advanced, very advanced system of or a concept of history that has been given to us by the Arabs to begin with. Now, this Islamic connection also draws a vertical line, vertical division of historical time. There is the historical time of Jahiliyyah, before the rise of Islam, before the coming of Islam, Jahiliyyah, and then there is a period after the coming of Islam. Now, Jahiliyyah, ignorance or savagery, it doesn't relate to history per se. It relates to Jahiliyyah about the concept of God. There was ignorance about the concept of God. But the notion of, but the division of time between Jahiliyyah on one hand and the rise of Islam on the other hand, or the coming of knowledge with Islam, coming of knowledge with Islam, that vertical line, sharp vertical line before and after, that is drawn in the Islamic tradition of history writing. And these inheritances came to medieval India as well, to the court historians that I'm talking of. That mainly this is dynastic history, history of various dynasties from the Delhi Sultanate onwards. There is it also implicitly, sometimes explicitly, but mostly implicitly, also draws this line between Jahiliyyah and the notion of history coming to the fore with Islam. As I said, mostly it is implicit, in the sense that very, very few historians of medieval India, court historians of medieval India, are concerned about history of India prior to the establishment of Delhi Sultanate and Mughal Empire, or prior to the establishment of the so-called Muslim power. So that is because that's an age of ignorance, as it were. You can forget that. You don't need to bother about that age. But it is implicit in that. There are exceptions, of course. Abul Fazl is the great exception. Some others also, but mostly it's treated as the age of Jahiliyyah in India. And then there is also some explicit statements to this effect. And the statements are like Badayuni says that he began his Muntakhabut Tawarikh with Subuktigin, not with Muhammad bin Qasim, but with Subuktigin. He says he began it with Subuktigin because Muhammad bin Qasim had established Muslim rule in India, but it was very transitory kind of Muslim rule. It didn't last very long. It's Subuktigin, whose son Mahmud of Ghazni, who established a Muslim rule in India, which never disappeared after that. Therefore, he's beginning his Muntakhabu Tawarikh with Subuktigin rather than with Muhammad bin Qasim. So he's aware of why he's stating why he's starting his. So he's establishing as it were, the Jahiliyyah of the Subuktigin or pre-Mahmud of Ghazni rule in India, or establishment of state in India. Prior to that, it's Jahiliyyah. But then, as I said, there is also Abul Fazl, who goes contrary to that. His departure from from this kind of history writing is immense. But that's another subject. Now, am I then saying that my second point? Am I then saying that history is a branch of Muslim theology? Medieval Indian history writing, court chronicles by these courtiers, is it a branch of theology? That's a kind of statement was made by long ago by Peter Hardy, who said that medieval Indian history is a branch of theology, Islamic theology, obviously. Now, I would be very suspicious of this assertion, although it's very closely linked to Islam, as I've tried to establish, and the chronological era that is used is almost always, except for Abul Fazl, it's always used Hijri era as the chronological framework within which history is narrated. So that its link with Islam is very, very firmly established. And yet, is it a branch of theology? I would have very serious doubt about it. One, because when history is a branch of theology, as it was treated in medieval Europe, for example, it's treated as one universal whole. Why is it treated? All history is treated as one universal whole. Why is it treated as one universal whole? Because history for them is the manifestation of God's will. And in God's will, God knows the past, God knows the present, God knows the future. So everything is integrated in God's vision. Nothing is independent of, nothing happens haphazardly or independently. It's part of a pattern in God's will or God's vision. And therefore, history is, as manifestation of God's will, is a single whole. Universal history is a single whole. Not world history, not the history of different regions, which is world history, but universal history as a whole. That's how medieval Europeans, who were church fathers mostly, they treated history. Medieval Indian historians, or medieval, the other historians, but medieval Indian historians that I'm specifically talking of, treat history as each event that is narrated is an independent event unrelated to any other event. So far from being an integrated whole, far from being one universal history which manifests God's will, it is a history which is completely disjointed. In fact, even their format is, in this year, this event took place. They would narrate that event. Then they will go to say, in this year, another event that took place was this. So the two events are narrated separately, independently, without any relationship between them or any other relations between any event. So there is no question of a pattern being established here. And this pattern is not established here because each event is a single independent event, because the causal explanation, each event is a manifestation of human will rather than God's will. Or human nature at the most, particularly the king's nature. Such and such king was a very brave, forward-looking, brave, energetic king like Alauddin Khalji. He went and conquered lots and lots of territory. Another king like Firoz Tughlaq was not so energetic and therefore sat at home, didn't conquer much territory. So the conquest of territory by one and not expanding the territory by another is a manifestation of not only their will, but their nature, human nature, so and so rebels because he is of rebellious nature. That is his nature. So and so is very submissive because that is his nature, and so on and so forth. So human will or human nature is the causal explanation of historical events rather than God's will. In that sense, it doesn't become a branch of theology. Now, this gives us the notion of strong rulers and weak rulers. In fact, Ziauddin Barni has a whole theory of nature, human nature. He says everyone's nature comprises contradictory qualities. In fact, he says even God's nature comprises contradictory qualities. It's a it's a good balance of these contradictory qualities, which leads to success in a ruler. His favorite ruler was Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, and imbalanced nature leads to utter failure, like Muhammad Tughlaq's failure. That's a kind of epitome of failure in his view. So that balanced or imbalanced nature of balance or imbalance of contradictory qualities in that king's nature is what explains history, not divine will and God's will and so on and so forth. Now, this was and we still read this. Akbar was a very liberal ruler, so he was very liberal in his approach towards all religions. Aurangzeb wasn't so liberal; he was quite dogmatic, so he followed a very dogmatic religious policy and so on and so forth, and everything turned upside down in one reign and turned right in one reign and turned upside down in another reign and so on and so forth. So even now we think of history in terms of the nature of the ruler. In fact, the academics don't do it so much. We have outlived that kind of history writing by now, but the kind of history that is propagated every day on TV channels and WhatsApp and social media, etc., it's you so and so was such a strong or a bad ruler or a good ruler or whatever ruler. Therefore, everything's happened that happened in his reign was good or bad or indifferent or whatever. So we still accept that in a way explanation given to us by medieval Indian historians. And this explanation continued even amongst professional historians down to the 1950s. Down to the 1950s, these court chronicles were kind of model for the history writing. They were almost being copied by historians of medieval India, of the previous generation, ABM Habibullah, K.S. Lal, etc., R.P. Tripathi, etc. They were almost copying these court chronicles. So it's only in the 1950s onward, late 50s onwards, 10 years after independence, that this kind of history began to change radically, because the very concept of history which the court chronicles had given us, which was which was centered on the court and therefore looked upon history from the foot of the throne, as it were. That concept of history has given way to a very much wider perspective on history, which includes society, economy, culture, even thought processes, and so on and so forth. Much wider now than it was earlier. So primarily these court chronicles gave us a very concerted view of history, very in their own terms, very cogent view of history. But now we have gone far beyond that kind of history, which we have practiced for nearly 300 or 400 years. Thank you very much. I hope I finished in time. Yes, I have.
Yes, sir. You have finished earlier.
Okay, I see. Okay.
2 or 3 minutes earlier.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Thank you very much, sir. It was an honor listening to you speak, and I've read a lot of your books. I was also a student of history during my graduation years, and I used to read you. And today I saw you face to face and enjoyed your conversation and your speech. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Without delaying any further, I would like to go to Professor Eva Orthmann. She is currently a professor and director of Institute of Iranian Studies, University of Göttingen, Germany. And she has taken a PhD in year 2000 in Faculty of Humanities Institute of Arabic and Islamic Studies, Martin Luther University in Wittenberg, Germany. Previously, she was a professor of Islamic Studies at Friedrich Wilhelm's University, Institute of Oriental and Asian Studies at Bonn, Germany. And she is currently researching on Indo-Persian translations, the Salihotra traditions, the philological practices, New Persian language, and Arabic culture in Iran, Central Asia, and North India during the 1st century of Hijri. And she has also done reviewing activities since year 2000. And she has published various articles and chapters in many books, which are nearly 6 to 7 articles and chapters. She'll be presenting an article on statecraft and litigation in the Ain-e Akbari. Professor Orthmann, we are at your service.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, then I will try to share my screen. I hope it is visible for you.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Yes.
It is very good. Then let me just arrange the screen properly. Okay. So, yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to this interesting conference. It is actually my great honor to be here today. The topic I would like to talk about is the translation and adaptation of Indian knowledge in the Mughal realm, especially in the period of Akbar, one of the fields of research in which Professor Abidi has been very active. I will limit myself to looking at the Ain-e Akbari, one of the major sources written by Abul Fazl, Akbar's chief advisor. The Ain-e Akbari is not an independent text, but the third part of the Akbarname. It is divided in 3 sections dedicated to household, army, and empire, but also contains a major part on Indian knowledge and traditions in the 4th part or book of the Ain. In between chapters on different schools of thought, the 18 sciences, methods of prognostication, and breath control, we find 3 chapters related to the Dharma Shastra tradition. A chapter on Rajaniti or statecraft, a chapter on Vyavahara, litigation, and a chapter on the 4 ashramas or stages of life. Looking at these 3 chapters from the perspective of Dharma Shastra literature, it makes sense to consider these chapters as belonging together. Abul Fazl, however, does not necessarily organize the knowledge according to the sources it has been taken from, but rather differentiates between theoretical and practical knowledge. According to him, the 4 ashramas are related to deeds and activities and therefore belong to the category of practical knowledge, while Rajaniti and Vyavahara belong to the theoretical part of knowledge. This differentiation might have been inspired by the Greek philosophical tradition. In my following talk, I will only talk about the 2 parts related to theoretical knowledge, Rajaniti and Vyavahara. Before starting to look in more detail into the Rajaniti and the Vyavahara chapter, let's briefly have a look at Abul Fazl's goals in writing about Indian knowledge. He informs us about his approach right at the beginning of the section on Indian learning. It is his goal to use knowledge as a means to provide peace and to reduce tensions between the different groups in the Mughal Empire. As Audrey Truschke has shown, this attempt belongs to a broader endeavor to consider Sanskrit as a valid intellectual tradition. Abul Fazl therefore encourages real seekers of knowledge to compare these teachings with those of philosophers, Sufis, and religious scholars. Obviously, a point of reference for Abul Fazl himself is Greek knowledge and philosophy, not the least Greek classifications of knowledge. At one point, he declares that he would have liked to arrange his description of Indian knowledge in the manner of Greek knowledge, but did not do so because of lack of time. Nevertheless, Greek knowledge and philosophy obviously were his benchmark. About his sources, Abul Fazl mentions to have met several groups of erudite people who informed him about the different fields of knowledge, of Indian knowledge. He, however, also highlights the importance of translation and complains the difficulties in finding a good translator. Obviously, he thus also relied on some written traditions. While it is not possible to get a clearer idea about his oral informants, we can understand to which tradition his written sources for the chapters on statecraft and litigation belong. The two most important texts on statecraft in the Indian context are Kautilya's Arthashastra and Manu's Dharmashastra. As we will see, especially the Dharmashastra of Manu bears similarity with Abul Fazl's text. We can assume that Abul Fazl either knew texts from the Dharmashastra tradition or that his informants based their teaching on it. However, it is also evident that Abul Fazl does not directly depend on Manu, since the differences between his information and the Dharmashastra of Manu are too important. It is more probable that he got his information from some digests which became popular from the 9th century CE on. I think there is some acoustic interference. We can also detect some influence from the aphorisms of Chanakya. Let's now
Professor Harbans Mukhia, your mic is unmuted. Please mute it, sir.
Okay, sorry.
Let's now first turn to the chapter on litigation, Vyavahara, or as Abul Fazl writes, Davari Danesh, the administration of justice. The chapter deals with the so-called 18 titles of litigation. The 18 titles dealt with are the classical repertoire and the same as in the Dharma Shastra literature. For example, non-payment of debt, deposits, sale without ownership, violation of conventions, etc. We find the same titles of litigation in the Dharma Shastra of Manu, but the single descriptions differ a lot from his text. Inter alia, Abul Fazl's chapter includes a rather long section on ordeals, a topic only very briefly mentioned by Manu. Abul Fazl's description seems to confirm what he had declared in an introduction to the section on Hindu learning, to have discussed with different groups of experts. He actually assumes the role of an external observer, saying, for example, the experts of the Indian region do not recognize more than 18 kinds of litigation, or this ordeal they apply only to Brahmans. They distinguish 3 kinds of slander, or they wash an idol, bought. This last example is, by the way, the only instance where we find a rather pejorative terminology with regards to Indian beliefs, designating their images of goddesses as bought, idol. Since this is the only instance in the passages I have so far looked at, and since Abul Fazl otherwise emphasizes his regard and esteem towards Hindu traditions and scholars, I wonder, however, if bought in Abul Fazl's time had lost this pejorative smack. But Abul Fazl does not only observe, he also compares and comments on different attitudes and approaches. So he writes, it shouldn't be less than 4 witnesses, but according to some, Nazde Barhi, 3 are sufficient and also 1 can be all right. Or the judge must cause the plaintiff, or as some say, Nazde Barhi, either of the 2 parties to undergo the ordeal. Maybe some of his comments are furthermore based on own observations. In what he writes about procedural ways of litigation, we get the impression that he might have been present in some legal proceedings. Generally, his dealing with litigation does not show any attempt of Islamization or of adaptation of the traditions he describes to existing norms of Islamic law. There is, of course, a certain amount of Persianization or domestication going on, since he generally uses Persian terminology to explain the Indian concepts. In this regard, the chapters related to Dharma Shastra differ a lot from the chapters on the 9 Indian philosophical schools, in which a huge amount of Sanskrit terminology is used. As, again, Old Petrushka has discussed with regard to these chapters, in these chapters are to such an extent overburdened by Sanskrit terminology that it is difficult to understand them. This kind of foreignization does definitely not take place in the chapter on litigation. Here it is rather the opposite. We can classify these two chapters as domestication of Indian knowledge. In spite of this domestication on a linguistic level, and in spite of obvious points in which a comparison between Indian and Islamic prescriptions would be at hand, Abul Fazl never compares the two legal systems. He also avoids typical Islamic expressions like Sharia or Adala, even when the observation of litigation is mentioned as one of the duties of a king. Here, it would have been easy to refer to justice, Adala, as a key concept of Islamic treatises on statecraft. But Abul Fazl uses different terms and maybe even consciously avoids a merging of the two different traditions. I'm emphasizing this fact since the situation is completely different with the chapter on Rajaniti, statecraft, to which I would like to turn now. The chapter on Rajaniti is a very condensed chapter on different aspects of kingship. The chapter deals inter alia with the 18 vices a king should avoid, the so-called perturbations caused by desire and anger, khohesh and khashan. Among the desires referred to, we find inter alia hunting, sleeping, finding fault with others, singing, dancing, and drinking wine. To the realm of anger belong the confiscation of property, abusive language, taking life without due deliberation, and making public the faults of others. I am mentioning these vices not only because the two key terms, khohesh and khashan, will later again play a role, but also because more topics dealt with in that chapter. In a very nice metaphor, the king is compared to a gardener. I quote, "The king resembles a gardener. What the latter does to embellish the garden, he does with regard to his subjects. He takes the thorns from the center to the side and properly attends to the verdant meadow, not allowing it to be soiled from outside. The disposer retains agitators of bad character at the edge of his realm to keep the inner parts of his palace free of them and to hinder malevolence from finding a way to it. From time to time, he prunes the large trees full of branches and leaves. The sovereign dissipates some of the grandees of his realm who have assembled plenty of friends and supporters. The weak ones he invigorates by irrigating them with water. The ruler strengthens destitute people from his army." This image has its roots in the appeal to eradicate the forms we find in the classical Dharma Shastra literature. However, the closest parallel to our text comes from the so-called aphorisms of Chanakya. There we read, "A good king is like a gardener who replants the uprooted trees, strengthens the weak ones, bends down those which shoot too high, weakens the too strong ones, and divides the united and trims the formed ones." Further points in the Rajaniti chapter include the importance of spies, the need to appoint advisors and governors, the buildings of fortresses, the appointment of a physician, an astrologer, the importance to fill the treasure, etc. All these elements are contained in Dharma Shastra sources. I was not yet able to identify one single source composed in the same way. It is rather a very abridged mixture of different treatises with a strong influence of Manu, but also of Chanakya. We may conclude that such treatises were probably widespread in Abul Fazl's time in between Hindu scholars, or at least in between specific groups of them. In difference to the chapter on Vyavahara, the Rajaniti chapter also contains elements of Mughal ideology. We thus find right at the beginning an allusion to Sura and Mana, the material and the spiritual realm, a key concept of Mughal ideology. I quote, "As much as the spiritual ruler of the kingdom necessitates to avoid desire and anger, the ruler of the material world is inclined to it." It is interesting to see that in this case, Sura and Mana are directly connected to desire and anger, two terms from the Dhamma Shastra tradition. The same happens with the next term, reason, Kherat. According to the text, reason helps to suppress anger and desire. Here again, the link to Mughal ideology is obvious, given that the necessity to use one's reason is again and again emphasized in Mughal sources. Such intermingling of elements taken from Mughal ideology with translations of Indian texts, especially in the field of statecraft, is happening in other texts too. I just would like to refer to the Mahabharata translation done for Akbar, in which we also find a part dedicated to statecraft. In this case too, Islamic and Mughal notions of statecraft are interwoven in the translated text. In the last part of my talk, I briefly want to inquire if the opposite also takes place. That's to say, if elements of Indian notions of statecraft have also been taken over in parts dedicated to Islamic or Mughal notions of statecraft. To search for such elements, we best look at the introduction of the Ain Akbari, where Abul Fazl explains his notions of kingship. Most of the concepts Abul Fazl is referring to there either belong to the realm of Islamic mirrors for princes or to Mughal ideology. We thus find references to the importance of justice, adala. Justice is, as already mentioned, a key concept in Islamic mirrors of princes. We often read about the so-called circle of justice, which indicates the interdependence of different groups in a kingdom and emphasizes the role of the ruler and his justice to balance their respective interests. As already mentioned, this key term is avoided in Abul Fazl's chapter on Vyahara. It clearly belongs for him to the Islamic and Iranian sphere. The introduction also deals with different ways of grouping people, either into 4 categories related to their profession, like traders, warriors, etc., or into 5 categories depending on their character. These groupings can easily be related to the so-called akhlaq literature, philosophical and ethical treatises which are based on earlier philosophical writings from the Islamic world. In Abul Fazl's classification system, the 4 groups of people working for the court additionally get a Mughal garb, because they are related to the 4 elements fire, water, air, and earth, a connotation we already find in texts related to Akbar's predecessor, Humayun. Besides references to mirrors of princes and the akhlaq literature, the preface also includes many key terms for Mughal ideology. These are allusions to the concepts of Sura and Mana. Royalty is explained as a light emanating from God and derived from the sun. Both ideas are very prominent in Akbar's kingship ideology. The text furthermore refers to the notions of Sulh-e-Kul and probably Deen Ilahi, and also emphasizes the importance of reasons. Besides all these references to Islamic and Mughal notions of kingship, however, we also find reference to Indian concepts. This is especially the case when Abul Fazl writes that royalty is a remedy against rebellion, a reason why subjects obey, and what ended up without king, the storm of strife and lawlessness would persist. This idea directly reflects the Dharma Shastric concept of Matsya Nyaya, the idea that without fear or punishment, the stronger fish would eat the weaker fish. The introduction furthermore refers to the concept of desire and anger or wrath. I quote, "The ruler holds the reins of desire in the hands of reason and makes wrath, the tyrant, pay homage to wisdom." It is interesting to see how in this case, reason, Kherat, gets the upper hand on desire and wrath, since Akbar, the ideal king according to Abul Fazl, is characterized by his rationality. We can thus deduce that Akbar, by his superior reason, subjugates the 18 Dharma Shastric vices and would never fall for them. In conclusion, we observe that Abul Fazl treats the different topics in his section on Indian learning in a very different way. On the one hand, in the chapter on Vyavahara, we get a more or less neutral description based on the communications of experts, which can be traced back to the relevant literature, like the Dharma Shastra and Artha Shastra texts of the Indian tradition. The most significant act of domestication takes place on the semantic level by translating almost all terms into Persian. On the other hand, in the chapter on Rajaniti, Abul Fazl interferes in the text by adding notions from Islamic mirrors of princes and from Mughal ideology. This joining of different notions is not restricted to those passages which deal with Indian statecraft, but takes also place in passages in which Abul Fazl explains his own ideas of ideal kingship, that's to say, in the introduction of the Ain. Here, however, the influence goes in the other direction, with Abul Fazl integrating elements of Indian statecraft in his preface. In this case, he does not anymore mark them as Indian, but just adopts them and uses them to describe his view of ideal rule. Hence, the foreign concepts are not anymore foreign here, but have thoroughly been adopted and domesticated and become a part of Mughal notions of statecraft. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Orthmann. It was extremely informative, and I really enjoyed your presentation. I hope the other participants of the conference also learned a few things from your presentation, and I hope somebody takes up future aspects of such a topic which can be discussed and reviewed in future researches. Thank you very much, ma'am. Without wasting any more time, I would like to go to Professor Nadeem Rezavi, who is from Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University. He is a professor of history there, and he has been the Charles Wallis Fellow in 2007 at SOAS London, and in 2008 he was a visiting fellow at Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris, and between 2016 to 2018 he was the chairman and coordinator of the Center of Advanced Studies in History, and he holds a PhD degree in upper middle class in Mughal India from AMU, or Aligarh Muslim University. His research interests focus on history and archaeology of medieval India and on Mughal dynasty in particular. He has authored many books which have been published by Oxford. The most famous of them is Fatehpur Sikri Revisited. It was published by Oxford in 2013, and then History Through Archaeology 2019, and many other books. He was also the president of Medieval Indian section of Indian History Congress during 2013 and 2014 session, and he was also chosen as section president in Bengal Itihas Sansad and Punjab Historical Conference. He is also a fellow of Shia Institute since September 2013. Professor Rezavi will be presenting an article on a 17th century tazkira, the Tazkiratul Shaykhul Khadam, being an account of a Muslim saint by a Hindu disciple. Professor Rezavi, we are at your service, sir.
Respected Chair, distinguished colleagues, fellow panelists, and dear friends. So far, we have had excellent, talks ranging from fieldnama to historiography to statecraft. And now I would want to take you to the people's history. But let me first of all thank the organizing committee and the members of the Professor Abdi Memorial Society, as well as the Department of Persian, University of Delhi, especially Professor Suhail Abidi Sahab, Professor Akhlaq Ahan Sahab, and last but not least, my senior from Aligarh, Rana Safavi, for extending an invitation to me to be a part of this illustrious gathering. This paper of mine is a small tribute to the great contributions of late Professor Abidi to the field of Persian language and literature of our country. Professor Abdi once famously said, and I quote him, "With the coming of the Muslims to the subcontinent, Persian, an Aryan tongue and sister language of Sanskrit, came to India, which is the confluence of diverse faiths, languages, and cultures, and which has a tradition of adopting and blending, and then producing a composite cultural unity in diversity," unquote. The two great ancient civilizations came together in the Indian subcontinent and resulted into a synthesis of cultures which can rarely be seen outside the subcontinent. Other scholars, people like Irfan Habib, have observed that as a result of these interactions, the largest number of works in Persian language were done in the Indian subcontinent rather than Iran itself. One such work is being chosen here as a tribute to Professor Abidi. The Tazkiratul Shaykhul Khadam, also known as Tazkira Pir Hassu Teli, is a metrical work written in the Punjab during the reign of Shah Jahan. It survives in the form of a unique manuscript, possibly an autograph copy, which is preserved at Aligarh Muslim University. The manuscript of this Tazkira is in the library of the Center for Advanced Study of History in Aligarh and is possibly the only surviving copy. Some scholars have confused this manuscript to be preserved in the Maulana Azad Library. Recently, I was able to get hold of a thesis by Dr. Nazia Latif, who has submitted a thesis in 2013 at Lahore. I'm really surprised that she was able to get hold of photographs of the full manuscript. And she confused it to be preserved in the main Maulana Azad Library. This paper is based on a detailed study of the manuscript, which is there in the Department of History, Aligarh. A reading of the text reveals that the author, Surat Singh, started compiling this manuscript on 21st Rajab, 1054 Hijri. That is equivalent to 23rd September, 1644 at Bhatinda, and completed it 3 years later in 1057, that is 1647 AD. Further, the manuscript has 182 pages written on both sides, with each folio comprising of 17 lines. The Tazkira throws much significant light not only on the local administration of the Mughals under Shah Jahan, but also illuminates many aspects of the thought processes and social ethos of the common people. However, it is interesting to note that the author also narrates certain incidents from the period of the earlier Mughals, especially from the reign of Akbar. The manuscript beautifully illustrates the emerging cultural practices and shared heritage of the period. The author, Surat Singh, entitled Aqil, was of the Kambo caste and Sarang Gotra. He was the son of Duni Chand, who in turn was the son of Jogi Das. And our author was born at Nateshar in Pargana Patti Haibatpur in Punjab. His family was by profession traders, but Surat Singh took the career of a revenue official holding posts at Lahore, Bhatinda, and other places. After his father's death, when he was passing through difficult times, he and his brother Gangaram were taken by Sheikh Sitrullah to Sheikh Kamal, the son and chief disciple of Pir Hassu, the oilman, that is Teli. He was a saint, to be enrolled amongst his disciples. This was a Sufic sect, formerly Malamatiyas, to which both Hindus and Muslims were admitted. For the first time, Surat Singh's Taskira, which is partly an autobiography and partly an account of the miraculous powers of Pir Hassu and Sheikh Kamal, was introduced to the academic world by Professor M. Athar Ali through his paper published in Medieval India, a Miscellany, which was actually published in 1972. As per the Taskira, it was through his brother Gangaram that Surat Singh was introduced to Sheikh Kamal, the chief disciple of Pir Hassu Teli. Surat Singh, whose real name was Shan Sarang, was passing through difficult times. And in this manuscript, he goes on to describe his, service in the Mughal bureaucracy. Some important light is also thrown on the travels of petty bureaucrats during that period, when Surat Singh is in fact lamenting about his career in the Mughal officialdom. In fact, if you read this Tazkira Pir Hassu Teli or Tazkira Sheikhul Khadam, you will find that throughout the account, the author keeps on lamenting the bad conditions in which he was surviving. But notwithstanding the fact that Surat Singh is frequently lamenting over uncertainties of jobs and shortage of money, he appears to have led a comfortable life. For when one of the persons named Saf Shikan Khan, probably a noble, offered him some money in return for his qasida in his praise, Surat Singh refused it. Further, he tells us that he had bought a house for himself for rupees 700, which was a sizable amount for that period by the standards of the 17th century, in one of the respectable localities of Lahore. Apart from the personal glimpses, the author also throws much light on the position, conduct, and thinking of the petty officialdom under the Mughal Empire. Thus, we find that a Pargana level official named Khwaja Hari Chand is said to have distributed money and cows among Brahmins. He reportedly ate with Brahmins each morning and offered meal to the members of all the 36 castes. Another petty official, Muhammad Shafi Buyutat, built a mosque in Mohalla Tilla, the place where Surat Singh himself lived, sometime before 1644. Gangaram, the brother of the author, when he himself was the Amil of Jahangirpur, grew fabulously rich. Abdul Karim, a scholar of some repute, is reported to have owned a house near Surat Singh. We are also informed by Surat Singh that the tomb of Pir Hassu Teli was built of contributions and donations made by the disciples of the Sheikh, most of whom belonged to the petty officialdom and trading communities. As for the cheatings and bunglings of the revenue officials, Surat Singh speaks of the cheatings by the Kanungos, who along with the Patwaris would sometimes fake the village records. It is ironic to note that a mystic like Sheikh Kamal once is alleged to give moral support to a Kanungos forging the village records with the object of frustrating an inquiry into the conduct by the Shikhdar. The alleged bungling by a Mushrif in the Sarkar of Saf Sikand Khan, while the author was posted there, also points to the prevalence of such practices. The scuffle in which Surat Singh got involved in the Sarkar of Aqil Khan was also due to an attempt made by some petty revenue officials to hoodwink the state treasury. At the very beginning of the Tazkira is a detailed discussion of Abul Fazl and his murder by Bir Singh Deo Bundela. The Tazkira also throws some light on the religious attitude and philosophy of its, not only its author, but also of the others who belong to his class. As has been pointed out, Surat Singh's allegiance was to Sheikh Kamal and through him to Pir Hassu Teli. Hassu Teli was born sometime in the 15th century, around 891 AH at a place called Makhiwal on the bank of river Chenab. Commenting on the maslak, the tradition of Hassu, Sheikh Kamal, we are told, they were designated as Malamatiyas. Apart from his connection with Islamic traditions, Hassu was endowed with a liberal mind. Though a formal Muslim, the saint never followed any of the basic observances and rituals prescribed by Islam. He never prayed in public nor paid the zakat. For was he not praying all the time? He never had anything stored up. So where was the question of paying the religious tax? In every breath, he circumvented the Kaaba of his heart. So where was the need of the formal ceremony of Hajj? All this was in consonance with what the Malamatiya taught, that in order to appear pious, the observable attributes of piety were avoidable. Surat Singh was naturally influenced by this philosophy. As a Hindu, he had also imbibed many of the inhibitions of his community. Thus, he would never touch meat and applauds Akbar and Jahangir for prohibiting cow slaughter. He even goes to the extent of claiming that a famine resulted when an Afghan disciple of Pir Hassu served the saint some meat. He is happy when someone fed Brahmins and gives them money and cows. But on an intellectual plane, he stands for Hindu-Muslim unity and applauds the Mughal emperors for acts of tolerance. The saint's trading seems to have bellowed him as far as caste restrictions are concerned. He takes pride in telling the lowly origins of his fellow disciples. Surat Singh's traditional Persian education and Hassu's and Sheikh Kamal's affinity to Islam seems to have familiarized him with the Islamic traditions. Thus, he begins his work with the praise of God, the Prophet, and his companions as naturally as an Orthodox Muslim would. Surat Singh ascribes to himself many mystical and spiritual experiences. Thus, once he informs us that he performed Hajj and approached the Prophet and saw Imam Ali standing next to him. Imam Ali beckoned Surat Singh to come nearer and heard a qasida from him. Surat Singh also claims to have met numerous saints like Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, Baba Kapoor, Baba Farid Ganj Shakar, and many others who were in the heavens. In one other such experience, Surat Singh met Pir Hasuteli himself. While performing a well-known mystical ritual against the advice of his seniors, Surat Singh fell ill and remained bedridden for 3 years. No medicine, he says, would cure him. Ultimately, he says, while crossing the Jamuna near Agra, he fell into the river. His spiritual mentor, through a miracle, raised him out of water and he was cured. He was even given the vilayat of Batala by Sheikh Kamal due to his spiritual accomplishments. All the same, it appears that Surat Singh's elder brother was more religiously inclined as compared to him. For he left the comforts of his home to join the Bairagis, grew a beard and left his hair to grow. He even started to saunter from jungle to jungle, eating only what was provided by the forests. Surat Singh even went looking for him and met him in a jungle. But soon Gangaram was fed up with the mendicant's life and returned to the fold of Sheikh Kamal. A versifier of 7,000 verses, all of the same meter, and a poet of some standing, whom even the poet critic like Shaida is alleged to have appreciated, a petty Mughal bureaucrat, a disciple of famous saint of oilmen, Pir Hasuteli, the author of Tazkira Pir Hasuteli or Tazkira Sheikh Khadam, is thus a man whose life sketch throws much light on the social and religious outlook of the bureaucracy, especially the lower rungs of the bureaucracy during the Mughal period. There are two other very significant things which are reported by Pir Hasuteli in this Tazkira, and that is the tomb of Baba Nanak, which he says that he visited, and the miracle which occurred at the place, at the time when Baba Nanak had died. Just like in the case of Kabir, our author tells that when Baba Nanak died, his body was claimed by both Hindus and Muslims, both the one trying to bury them, the other wanted to burn them. But just like as it happened in the case of Kabir, the body was disappeared, was replaced by flowers which were divided, some buried, some burned by the disciples of the saint. In other words, this Tazkira, the Tazkira Sheikhul Khadam, is a very important source for us to understand the social conditions and the ethos of the period of Shah Jahan, the 17th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Professor Rezavi. And I would like to thank you on the behalf of this seminar and this conference in short. And without wasting any more time, I think you have finished 3 minutes earlier than your scheduled time, sir. I'm thankful to you for that. Now I would like to go to Dr. Neha Vermani, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Folger Shakespeare Library, Washington, D.C. Prior to her previous appointment, she was awarded the PhD from Royal Holloway, University of London. And her research work locates food practices as an integral component of discourses on authority, civility, and connoisseur at the Mughal court. She is the author of Before Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Culture. In addition, she has written several articles and has been invited to speak at various conferences. I would like to call on Dr. Neha Vermani to please present her article. We are at your service, ma'am. Dr. Vermani, we cannot hear you.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Now you are.
Sorry. Thank you very much for extending the invitation for me to be a part of this conference. And I feel extremely humbled because I'm here presenting with people whose work I've read as a student. And also Professor Chandrasekhar, who taught me Farsi during my MPhil at JNU. And a small, I've not authored the book. I'm part of this project called Before Farm to Table. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow on this project, and it's hosted by Folger Shakespeare Library in DC. Now I'm going to start with my presentation, and I'm going to be talking about feasts, or as I call them, events of ritualized consumption, and they form backdrop of events in almost every possible Mughal narrative. And they have remained on the margins for really long in terms of how they are discussed or seen or understood. And this paper will place them at the center of courtly mechanizations and examine their function with regard to concepts of companionship, belonging, and service. That is the bonds that glued the court society together. So writing about his father, Umar Sheikh, Babur notes that Sheikh was a good-natured man who drank a lot. He was good company at bi-weekly parties that he organized. So Babur was kind of an heir to this kind of Timurid courtly tradition that was typified by feasts and banquets held in grand garden pavilions where food consumption and wine consumption, along with male bonding, were integral aspects of these activities. Later, writing in 1528 to his son Humayun, Babur advises him against seeking solitude, as he says it was unbecoming of a king. He advises him to gain trust of his companions and supporters, and he says that drinking wine was pleasant with comrades and boon companions, Hamsohbat and Hamkas. The narrative of Baburnama, from the time Babur gains control over Kabul in 1504 onwards, is peppered with detailed descriptions of feasts that he and his retinue of men participated in as they moved from one spot to another. This period marked the end of the throneless phase of his political career, and occasions of feasts or ritualized consumptions preceded or followed their raids against Afghan chiefs in and around Kabul, and during the initial incursions and the ultimate conquest of Hindustan. While it is impossible to reproduce every detailed description of these multiple feasts that were organized around streams and in gardens, just to convey the flavor of the social intercourse that informed these gatherings, I will now move my attention to the period which Stephen Dale calls the Timurid Winter Social, which was conducted in Herat, where Babur was guest at a lot of parties hosted by his Timurid cousins. He attended these elaborate parties organized by Badi Usman Mirza, where food was served in gold trays, silver vessels were employed to again serve different kinds of beverages, foodstuffs. There's description of every kind of foodstuff which was present at this place. In particular, Babur notes how he didn't know how to carve a roasted fowl, and that is the painting that you see here, and his cousin very graciously took upon him to carve the duck for him, and that's the painting that you see. Now, apart from these lavish details which we find, Babur also draws attention to the question of etiquette. Now, there's a general understanding that during the early Mughal period, because the bureaucratic administrative structures were not so stable or had not yet fully come into existence, these were primarily very fluid spaces. But as we read his Baburnama, we do realize that he pays a lot of attention to protocol. So as the Badshah of Kabul and not a throneless Mirza anymore, he bemoans the lack of respect he believes should have been conferred upon him. He records that at first of these gatherings, the Mirza did not greet him in the correct manner. And then he says what he was expecting and what happened when Mirza and Babur came face to face. That's the first quote that you see. However, on the second incident, in a second gathering, Babur actually asserted his stature, and that's the quote from the second gathering that you see in the lower half of the screen. He remarks that these gatherings were not companionable, were not happy, companionable spaces, and he subsequently comments on the importance of acting according to good rules in assemblies and courts, at banquets and dinners, in sitting and serving. Few days later, Muzaffar Mirza, who was his younger cousin, invited Babur to a garden party. And it must be noted, contrary to the popular understanding of Babur as an alcoholic, a man given to alcoholism, Babur till this point in his age had abstained from alcohol consumption. He says that it was at this dinner party that he first felt the pangs of desire towards consuming alcohol, but then he decided against drinking alcohol because he says in the previous dinner party hosted by an elder cousin, he'd refused to drink alcohol. So if he does so at a younger cousin's house, it might constitute an affront. And a decision was made that both the Mirzas would throw a combined dinner party for Babur, where Babur would eventually consume alcohol. We don't find any description of this in the Baburnama because a section of the text is missing. Continuing with the Timurid winter social, where he was still going on to attend these parties, Babur records that on learning about Muzaffar Mirza's entertainment, his elder cousin arranged yet another garden party, and there a lot of the retinue of men which were with Babur wanted to drink, but out of respect for his presence, they were being hesitant. They would hide in corners and try to drink, or they would conceal what they were holding in their hand so that Babur doesn't take notice. To which Babur then seemed to have told them that everybody had blanket permission from him to drink at this party because it was given by someone who was like a father and elder brother to me. So what we can conclude out of these lavish parties that he was attending was the intersection of consumption manners with the complex dynamic of power, rank, and social conventions of seniority are foregrounded in these episodes. And similar concerns run through the Baburnama in multiple instances that come across that are there about feasts and such dinner parties. Yet another example which I'll now draw our attention to is from 1500 AD, where Babur was just a nominal Timurid prince like many other. He was engaged in warfare to claim a territorial empire in Central Asia. And post defeating his Mongol foe, Sultan Ahmad Tambal, Babur returns to Fergana to discover that Muhammad Dost, who was son of Ali Dost, who had served Babur's paternal grandfather and was a relative of Babur's grandmother, had begun to assume royal heirs. What does he mean when he says royal heirs? He says that Dost Muhammad had started holding formal dinners, and he could not really do anything about it because he was being mindful of his political reality, where he neither had the authority nor the power to forbid such unprecedented behavior, but he says his position still was debased by father and the son, that is Ali Dost and Dost Muhammad. Yet another example that conveys Babur's complete lack of command over ritualized acts of consumptions comes from events that followed the siege of a fortress near Fergana in 1495. Here Babur, the nominal prince, did not have the authority to execute the emperor's prerogative of granting ulush, that is the champion's portion of the feast, which is granted to a person who succeeded in distinguishing himself with the sword. Now, such instances establish that even during the earlier phase of Babur's life, the acts of ritualized consumption and their ability to construct and convey authority and power dynamics were not divorced from understanding of etiquette. In this sense, the change from 1495 to 1506 AD was not about the awareness, but concern for stricter observation of etiquette, either voluntarily or through assertion in the presence of now Padshah of Kabul, that is Babur. While camaraderie and conversation of gatherings were important indices for Babur, as has been pointed out by Stephen Dale, I would stress that the manner in which these conversations and this camaraderie played out was an equally significant register. There's an inherent realization in Babur's narrative that power and authority were generated, performed, and conveyed at these sites, and not following protocol could negate this authority, thereby positing ritualized consumption as an activity layered with political undertones. Thus, the notion that authority begets a certain kind of protocol and that protocol in turn signifies authority is clearly spelled out in the Baburnama. Now, ritualized transactions aimed at political and social bonding were not limited to Babur's interaction with his kin group or beygs that he had grown up with or men who were serving him. Older rebellious and neo-political agents encountered in Kabul and Hindustan were also frequently invited to break bread or share wine with Babur. On returning from Herat to Kabul later in 1506 AD, Babur put down Mirza Khan, who during his absence had been set up as Padshah of Kabul by his cousin Mirza Duglat. Ending the conflict and pardoning Mirza Khan for his rebellion, Babur invited him for an interview, offered him sharbat. Babur tasted the sharbat before offering it to Mirza Khan so as to assuage the latter's fear that in a ploy to kill him, the sharbat might be poisoned. Similarly, in 1526, Babur extended hospitality to the recently defeated Afghan chief, Fath Khan, by offering him wine at a gathering that was held beside a large pool surrounded by tamarind trees. Feasts were organized to celebrate victories over Ibrahim Lodi and Rana Sanga. The former was strategically held in the doomed portico in the middle of Ibrahim Lodi's tomb, and participation in this feast was not just limited to Babur's beygs and warriors. Now, Stephen Dale, who's worked predominantly on Babur, and following him, Ruby Lal, who also works on early Mughals, they framed the political significance of Babur's gathering by dubbing them as some kind of a parliament where members of aristocratic elite were regularly brought together to deliberate on political decisions, where loyalties and friendships were galvanized against a vociferous landscape of the late Timurid society that was marked by notoriously fragile bonds of kinship. While this analysis holds true for Babur's reign, it also presents limitations because it advances the notion that fragility of kinship bonds was a feature specific to the late Timurid period and correlates the efficacy of ritualized acts as political tools to such situations of flux. Firstly, with regard to the question of fragile kinship bonds, the Mughals never had a clearly articulated system of imperial succession. From Babur to Aurangzeb, it remained flexible and relatively open, with sons of the emperor having an equal legitimate claim to the throne. Consequently, the tense competition ensued among brothers, which did not necessarily and always get resolved on battlefield. Munis Farooqi has highlighted the significance of princely households in building strong networks of friendships and alliances as a counter to the existing or new tensions and confrontations that followed. Within this world of struggle for power, ritualized consumption was employed as a tool to either neutralize past animosities or, in some cases, handle potential future threats. An example for the latter comes from War of Succession between Shah Jahan's sons. Pledging loyalty and friendship to his brother Murad Bakhsh and extending support to his claim to throne, Aurangzeb succeeded in inviting Murad for an intimate wine fest. By the end of the evening, when Murad was inebriated and enveloped in a sense of security, Aurangzeb's troops caught him off guard and imprisoned him. The efficacy of this ploy was rooted in the idea that feasting together signaled relationships of belonging, loyalty, and withering of animosity. Use of feast as a trope for bonding is also evidenced by incidents that followed the siege of fortress of Taliban, where Humayun's rebellious brother Mirza Kamran was hiding. As Mirza submitted by coming out and paying homage to Humayun, Humayun remarked, "Let's meet in a brotherly fashion," following which a goblet was brought in. Half was given to the emperor, the other half was given to Mirza Kamran. Kamran, along with his other brothers, Mirza Hindal, Suleiman, and Askari, were ordered to sit onto the left of Humayun. With 4 brothers seated on the carpet, Gulbadan Begum wrote, such great variety of food and fruits were brought in that there was more than enough for everyone at the assembly. Uncritical engagement with Dale's line of argument also presents the risk of overlooking the fact that state building, even in centuries after Babur's conquest of Hindustan, was a constant process of consent generation, relationship building, and negotiation between the emperor, his old and newly recruited elites. Institutions of administrative and bureaucratic systems did not undermine and negate these processes. To better understand the functioning of power dynamic at the court, we need to shift focus to mechanisms through which relationships were generated and new members absorbed, even when the empire was, quote unquote, at its peak. Now I'll move to Akbar's reign, where during Akbar's reign, the victory over Daud Khan of Orissa in 1575 AD was celebrated by inviting Khan to a banquet in which he was made to bow down in the direction of the imperial capital, which is the seat of the emperor. Following that, the entire day was spent in feasting and rejoicing. Akbar was not himself physically present in Orissa. It was his governor who had attained this victory, and thus the feast was conducted in the emperor's name, and therefore the act of bowing down in the direction of the capital. In yet another incident, Akbar, on learning about the reconciliatory feast that Adam Khan had organized, without seeking his permission to mark victory over Baz Bahadur of Malwa, marched to Malwa to tame Khan's behavior. However, Mahamanga, who was Adam Khan's mother and superintendent of wet nurses during Akbar's reign, managed to diffuse the situation by coaxing Khan to organize a feast in honor of Akbar.
Dr. Vermani, you have 3 minutes left.
So the point that I'm coming to is feasting, banqueting was placed at par with warfare, and Abul Fazl refers to this, where Bazn is at par with Razn, and in addition, and these spaces were used to then articulate relationships. I've not reached the point where I actually talk about why certain food objects were employed in these feasting spaces. I would quickly summarize it, where I'll just move to the last slide and talk about, for example, we know wine was consumed. Whether wine is Islamic, un-Islamic, that's a completely different topic. But what happens with certain food commodities like wine, coffee, pan, which were exchanged during these ritualized events of consumption, was these brought about certain type of qualitative change in the body of the consumer, which then combined with the barakat or the spiritual effluva of the emperor who's passing it on to the consumer, fashions the body to be, prepares the body for imperial service. So wine, for example, is supposed to elevate melancholy, stimulate intellect. Similarly, chewing of pan brings a humoral balance in the body. It freshens your mouth, where good smell in this Mughal tradition is considered to be a sign of intellect. The color, the red color that it imparts on your lips is a sign of being war ready or sacrificing yourself for the empire. So there were different kinds, apart from protocols and self-fashioning of the emperor and the relationships that he's building, a lot of specific food products were also employed to fashion the consumer to be able to signify that the consumer is going to serve the emperor, build bonds of loyalty between the two. So with that, I would just say that instead of just negating or relegating these sort of descriptions to the realm of decadence and hollow pageantry, it would bode far better if we start reading into these as to how these activities made sense to the people who were conducting them, and not just mindlessly slip into these descriptions and just think of Mughals as decadent or pleasure-enjoying set of emperors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vermani. I wish we had more time for you to finish your presentation and do it a complete review. I would request now the chair of the session, Professor Chandrasekhar, to please give your remarks about this session.
It was a very interesting session from teacher to student, Professor Mukhia to Neha Vermani. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
School of Language.
Yeah, it seems
Somebody
someone
else is also speaking. I think it's Professor Mazhar Asif who is speaking. Sir, can you please mute your microphone?
नहीं, ये सुरेश को देना.
Professor Asif, can you please mute your microphone?
Should I continue?
Yes, sir, please do.
Yeah, very interesting session in which major presentations were basically on the court life, court politics, and the court histories, from elephant to the banqueting. Fabrizio and Eva Orthmann, who are part of this Perso Indica project for long and working on the scientific texts, especially written in the Indo-Persian period, and highlight these animals, especially elephant and horses, on which already Eva has published a long paper in Perso Indica project, and variety of the texts which are used by Fabrizio, especially from the Asafia library about the elephant. Similarly, Professor Mukhia definitely has given us more and more lessons how to compare the history of Europe and the history writing of this whole medieval period, and the variety of the histories which were written, and how the change took place after 1950s. Obviously, Professor Mukhia is a teacher to all of us and has again given a very good teaching lesson to us. Contrary to these history writings, Professor Nadeem has given another information about the Tazkira of Hakuteli, which is given a non-courtier history, which reminds me of Nuskha Dilgusha of Bims and Qais, who has also spoken about the events which are not related to the court history, and how some people like these writers has to face problems within the court and outside the court for their beliefs and the other traditions they are following in that cosmopolitan society of that time. And also the details about the morphology of the city and the other parts. Similarly, Ain-e-Akbari, which is an encyclopedic work on which Eva has spoken at length, and comparing it with other scriptures and giving the almost same titles, but with some different connotations that way. A very good study she has done, and I remember the conference which took place on Ain-e-Akbari in 6th Perso Indica project conference at Tokyo, and she has presented another aspect of the Ain-e-Akbari in that. Neha, thanks to acknowledge that I had taught her Persian also at JNU, is working a lot on this aspect. In fact, she needs a special presentation in this our Avdisa Foundation, and she can apprise us of the more information. I was waiting to listen her to give us the names of the dishes which used to be served in this banqueting. Because here I see, apart from the duck, for the main guest, they serve the horse meat also. And it is also in one of the starters, and usually nowadays, these Uzbeks have the 4 courses. At least 2 courses are meant for the starters, and in which this horse meat is served. Duck is also served, but very rarely. So that's why it was surprising that I hope Neha in some other presentation will tell us what kind of the dishes are mentioned and what are the ingredients of these dishes if she could find in the Persian sources. Thanks a lot to all, especially Bhai Sohail and Madam Bilkis, who are organizing this conference, and Dr. Rajinder Kumar from Department of Persian. Thanks a lot, and especially thanks and with all regards to Shahid Mehdi Saab, who is our patron of Professor Abdi's this foundation. I again convey my regards to all of you. Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. I also thank everybody for attending this event. Right now, we have around 42 participants. and they were fluctuating from time and again during the whole session. I thank everybody for their time which they have given to this session. Hopefully we'll see you again tomorrow in other sessions. I would like to give the stage to Dr. Professor Abdi's son, I think, Dr. Suhail Saab.
Hope to see everyone again tomorrow.
Okay, sir.